One moment, everybody. Right. Well, here we go again. Don't we? Here we go again. I'm not arrogant enough to say I'm a prophet or anything like that, but this is the news today. If it's true, and of course it is worth saying right now, it's unconfirmed. Capcom haven't made a statement or anything like that. It's just a rumor at this point. But the rumor is that we're going to get Resident Evil 8 next year, and then a year later we're going to get a Resident Evil 4 remake. And this is exactly the path that I was afraid we were going to go down once they started remaking the games. Resident Evil 2 remake was demanded ever since, the 2002 GameCube remake of the first game. And all these years later, I understand the business sense in Resident Evil 2 and 3 being, in a sense, remade, because the assets don't upscale terribly well to HD, although that said, since the Seamless HD projects have come along, that's kind of nullified that somewhat, and I would just love to see those versions get ported and released on all current consoles and PC and everything like that. But I that's honestly not going to be the case. It's not going to happen. So I understood the business sense in remaking Resident Evil 2 and 3. You can rebuild the assets and redo everything that those initial games did in for a new generation of fans, and update the controls and all that. Unfortunately, they, as good Resident Evil experiences as they are, as much as I do find Resident Evil 3 remake quite a lot of fun, they fall way short for me personally of what those original games were, and what those original games mean to me. Obviously, we haven't released the latest podcast yet. It's still being worked on, where we discuss and review Resident Evil 3 Remake, but it's safe to say that it falls short for me in a lot of areas. I'm not going to say too much now because I want to leave that for the podcast, but one of my closing statements is it's a fine Resident Evil experience, but it falls for me as a remake. Pretty much the same stance that I had with Resident Evil 2, but more so in this sense. And it's worth pointing out that across the 3 remakes that we've had now, each subsequent remake has moved further and further away from that original trilogy and original source material. You've got the first remake, which is very faithful, only changed and added a few little things here and there, but for the most part the mansion layout was the same with a few additional bits bolted on, and it was all just done so respectfully and lovingly, a loving sort of retelling of that first game. Resident Evil 2 Remake, as we've said before, it's like a Cliff Notes version of the game. The main core details are there. It's just all the nuance, I think, was unfortunately lost. A lot of the, some character beats and things like that were missing and replaced with things I didn't necessarily like. And it was a more streamlined affair, and nothing said that more than how sort of dumbed down the scenario and zapping system was. And then we get to the Resident Evil 3 remake, and at times it's unrecognisable from the game it's supposed to be remaking. And this is where we get to a point where we have to say these are not remakes in a sense now. By the time that the first game, I would say, was a remake. The second game was a remake because it had enough of the original game sort of DNA, if you like, in there to still be just about be classed as a remake. Resident Evil 3 has come along, and this is definitely a reimagining. No matter which way you want to spin it, it's a different retelling of events. There's been massive timeline changes for those in the community who like your Outbreak games, and you follow the timeline and the dates very, very religiously almost. Then you will know that Remake 3 takes a lot of that and has changed it to tell what I think is to tell the raccoon story in a more condensed, more timely fashion. And by the time you get to the end of Remake 3, it's, like I say, it's very nearly unrecognisable from the game that it's attempting to remake. So we have, we've got a difficult situation now. Resident Evil 4 is looking to be the next remake. And the difference is this. for the previous remakes to needing to exist, I tended to blame console manufacturers and things like that for not giving people a better form of like backwards compatibility in current machines. It's not, in a sense, it's not Capcom's fault that the modern day machines we play games on today can't play games from previous years. So the need for a remake, in a sense, and as we've discussed, that Resident Evil 2 and 3 had like quite dated in terms of how the games were built. I know not everybody likes their tank controls, for example. So I can appreciate, even if I disagree, I can appreciate why these things need updating for today's generations. I mean, I personally love that games exist within their own time. I can, disagreeing with how a game controlled 20 years ago is not a thing for me, because I can just put myself back into that mindset and I can play the game as you were meant to play it back then. The fact that like Resident Evil 4, for example, doesn't have dual analog controls in a traditional sense that we expect now with like first person shooters doesn't bother me. It was designed to be a standstill aim and shoot kind of game, and I still think it plays really, really well because the mechanics are built around that. So you remake that, you're going to have to remake the whole thing. But going back to the point, I understood the business sense with having to remake Resident Evil 2 and 3, because unless you play the Seamless HD projects, which have had a lot of love put into them, those games, they do not look great on a big 1080p 4K television. They just don't. Those backgrounds were only captured in so low resolution that you've needed a Seamless HD project to extract the life out of them and to give them life again. And so I understood the reason why you needed to sort of future-proof Resident Evil 2 and 3 for future generations and make it very easy to make. This is one of the reasons why I think they ported Code Veronica to the MT framework for that reason. So it'd be very easy to port to PC and everything like that. Why that hasn't happened yet is unknown. But Resident Evil 4, its architecture and everything works on everything. It's available on PC in an Ultimate HD version. It's available on PlayStation 4. It's available on Xbox One. And it will continue to be available on things. So all I can say from a very cynical point of view that this is nothing but a cash grab. And it's quite dangerous territory for Capcom to play with, I think, because this isn't going to be a remake of a 20 plus year game that worked on PlayStation 1s, used very sort of old fashioned gaming techniques like camera angles and tank controls and things like that. This is, Resident Evil 4 does have tank controls. That's the funny thing what some people don't realise, is the controls are exactly the same. It's just from an over the shoulder perspective. So short of sort of updating the game to like a modern control system and make it a little bit more accessible, although it's still accessible and plays fine today, if there's one thing Resident Evil 4 does do well, for all the problems I have with it personally from a lore point of view, Resident Evil 4 has always played really well. It's repetitive, it's overlong, it's bloated in some sections, but the sections it does work are absolutely wonderful. I don't think anyone would sit here and say the village sequence is not a genuinely timeless sequence of video game, because it truly is. It's got some great boss battles, some exceptionally well done set pieces. So yeah, going back into the point that it's a bit of a dangerous territory for Capcom. Resident Evil 4 to the video game industry, not necessarily to a lot of Resident Evil fans like myself and many others who don't appreciate what it did over much for the storyline or the how it resolved the Umbrella storyline. Resident Evil 4 is a bit of a video game darling. It's there's people champion it very much. It tops many games of all time lists and things like that, and it's a very beloved sort of game. You only have to look at some of the, it's not mixed as such, but it's certainly more mixed than Resident Evil 2's, Resident Evil 3's feedback. And as I said earlier, these remakes are moving further from the source material the more we go into them as a concept. Remake 1 to 3. Remake 3 uses less of Resident Evil 3. And, what they're going to do with 4? Are they going to take 3.5 elements and insert them in there somewhere? They're going to redo the Umbrella storyline. And if that's the case, then you're potentially making a game that won't be as well loved, because I know a lot of people do appreciate the reset that Resident Evil 4 offered. But you're also in a situation where this canon that we talk about a lot on the podcast, the diagram that I drew and everything like that, you're going to be in a situation where it's further shattered. And, the remakes of 2 and 3, for as much, as I don't feel they tell the Raccoon storyline as well as the originals did, it was fairly self-contained. It was these few days in September, and obviously the lore and the files and everything around that are also changed, but the actual core of it was the end of September, beginning of October, and the bombing of Raccoon. If we then go beyond that, and we go years ahead of that into Resident Evil 4 territory, and that takes the same liberties with the canon as Resident Evil 3 Remake does, then the lore and the canon as we know it is irreparably damaged, unless you do just take a stance where you say the remake's just not canon. They tell these stories in a different way, but they're just not canon. I see Batman on our Discord today has, speculated, could this tell a different version of how Umbrella gets taken out, and then this remake saga comes to a close. But this is where this is where no one knows. This is where I then ask everybody, as I've been saying for 5 years now, since that first day that Remake 2 got announced back in 2015, was you have to be careful what you wish for. And this is exactly what I thought would happen once we start. My dread was that Resident Evil 2 Remake was massively successful, because then it makes some gears in certain Capcom heads turn and say, hey, there's money to be made in this. And by the time we're in Resident Evil 4 now, I just think this is just a way to just make more money. But this time it's dangerous, because you're potentially ruining the legacy that Resident Evil 4 has to the video game industry. What if Remake 4 comes out and it's absolutely awful? Not just as a Resident Evil story, not just as its effect on the canon, but what if it's just simply a bad video game? Where does that leave Capcom then? And then you just get cries of why did they do this? What was the point? Where does this journey end? I've asked this question out of so many of you. I ask it all the time on Twitter. I ask it on the podcast. Where does this remake saga end if it didn't end with 3? I could understand, as much as I disagreed with it, I could understand a need for Code Veronica in some people's eyes. I know the camera angles thing, the tank controls and that, and some of the visual appearance of that game is quite dated. I get it, but I still like the HD version of it, and I think the new lighting actually adds a bit of life to that game, and the fact that it's MT framework, now means it's portable. It's get it released on everything, kind of thing, not just a shameless PS2 port that's on the PlayStation 4 store. But where does it end? In 5 years' time, are we going to see a Resident Evil 5 remake? Are we going to see a Resident Evil 6 remake? Are they just going to remake the original in the RE engine? This just has to come to a stop, guys, and we need to just move on. And I know what we know about Resident Evil 8 has worried a lot of people. I've been here too many years to let the concept, a radical concept of something, put me off a title. I love Resident Evil 7. I thought it was wonderful. So let's just see what happens. But I don't speak for everyone there. I know there's plenty of people with problems with Resident Evil 7, so I'm not speaking for you at all. But I just want to see this remake thing come to an end. I'm tired, and I don't know whether I really want to see. We've wasted, in my opinion, 5 years of budget and production and hard work on games I find inferior to their original versions. I don't know whether I really want to see another 5 years of this, and I certainly don't want to see a game that's very personal to me is in Resident Evil 5 redone in a different way or reimagined in a different way. I just this is going to be really, really interesting how they approach this. If it's true, it might be all worrying and fretting over nothing. It might be a statement out, from Capcom in the morning saying, confirm this is not true, and that'd be great. But yeah, I've rambled a bit, so I'll leave it there. Are you looking forward to a Resident Evil 4 remake? What would you change? Chuck it in the comments below. And I will just end this video by saying this is my personal point of view, not consulted with the guys or anything like that. This is my thoughts on remakes. Still, here I sit, still ranting about remakes. I don't think that is ever going to change. And I wish to hell it would, because believe me, everybody, I'm as bored moaning about them as you are listening to me rant about them. So, there we go. Have a great rest of your Easter weekend. Let us know what you think in the comments. And yeah, look forward to the next episode of the Resident Evil podcast very soon. Cheers. Cheers.